Another episode of Talking Deals with David. Today I'm joined by Kisan Patel from Deal Room and M&A Science, and we're going to be talking about, no big surprise today, M&A. Kisan, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I've been a big fan really since I started posting on LinkedIn, checking out your podcast and all the great posts and things that you do through M&A Science and Deal Room, and so it's been terrific to to finally actually get a chance to meet in person, and then really appreciate you coming on and talking deals.
Likewise, I see a lot of your posts, so it's always fun to collaborate with others that are just passionate about the industry.
Yeah, it is. It's it is. We were talking before we jumped on that, in many ways, people who do M&A, they often are kind of, I don't know about secretive, but they definitely don't like to always jump out, and do like what we're doing on LinkedIn and sort of be a little bit more public about it. But I think it's been great meeting other people that, are, I don't know about being deal junkies, but interested in M&A and excited about deals. And I think it also helps other people who are getting into M&A or, thinking about doing deals to, see some of the fun parts about it too. It obviously has a lot of high pressure, high stakes, but it can be a lot of fun as you know, and enjoyable. And this, I think, gives us a ability to showcase that a little bit.
It's about time to open up the black box here.
Yeah, I think definitely. All right, well, everybody who's joining, of course, if you haven't joined one of these before, we are live. So if you want to participate, which would be awesome, and I know Kisan and I both would love to hear comments, see where you're listening in from, and if there are topics that you want to talk about M&A or things related to M&A, just drop them in the comments. I'll try to check those out as we go and address as many of those as we can. So Kisan, to kick it off, instead of sort of doing introductions or other things, I posted this morning a kind of a question, which was, when you close an M&A deal, which for us lawyers is kind of the end, we're celebrating. In the old days, you would get together, have a closing dinner, celebrate. We would go off to another deal, and I wouldn't think much about it. That was sort of it. But I asked this morning, is closing an M&A deal the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end? What do you think about that as you look at M&A deals and how they are constructed, executed, and then completed after a deal is done?
I think they call it day one for a reason. It's first day of action and really focusing on delivering on the intended value of your thesis. I like the analogy. I remember I had an interview, I think Toby Tester, he used the promissory note. He's like, you have a promissory note and you need to cash it in, which is executing on all those activities post-close to create that intended value.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. I mean, I think one of the biggest evolutions that I've seen in deal work is really what you were onto a lot earlier than I think most people, and that's trying to find ways to think about the end state, how you envision the combined company once an acquisition is sort of fully integrated, but be thinking about that really from the very beginning stages of a deal, and let that help drive how you think about the deal and how it's structured and how it's diligenced, all of those components that I think for a long time people viewed maybe in silos or separated more than they should have.
I agree with that. That's probably the big evolution I've seen from like 8 years of conversations, that there's definitely a bigger emphasis on thinking through. I would say a couple of key things, right? One is crystallizing the end state from the very beginning, like a founder, CEO to CEO conversation. What is this ultimately combined company going to look like? Can we really crystallize that? Can we think that through from a customer's perspective? What is a combined company going to look like? What's that customer journey going to look like? And then from there is the values, culture component of it. I feel like everybody uses like similar corporate buzzwords to talk about values, but then breaking that down through a conversation and examples, like what does that mean? How does it actually correlate to the way decisions are made in the company. How does the leadership management styles, and then you really start understanding more, at least a high level of that culture, and then build on it
Mhm.
earlier as opposed to later. And then I think it starts building into like your integration thesis. Can you start developing that before you sign a LOI? Like this is what the plan is, how we're going to bring these companies together, make the deal successful.
Yeah, it's so important to do that, and I've been trying at least over the last 4 or 5 years, as I've been thinking more about that and, spending time more with clients of mine that, are really, really good deal makers and have had maybe bucked the trend and had actually very successful track records, with their deals. And I think it's so important. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially as AI and sort of other tech advances are helping in that. But when I started, and even today on deals, it's such a siloed, compartmentalized process, and to me, it's a very inefficient process. But more importantly, it leads to a lot of information that is missed or not properly integrated, in what I do on the legal side, the structuring of deals, thinking about risk allocation, but also it doesn't get you in a position where you're really day one ready, which in today's world might even be too late, that you really have to be thinking about that integration and what you see for the business, a year from now, 2 years after the deal is closed. And that needs to kind of frame how you um, approach a deal. But how do people get away from that approach, this inefficient kind of siloed deal process?
It's becoming like inevitable, but I agree. I think like holistically, just the industry moves a lot slower than other industries. I love looking at sales and marketing for examples, just how quick they adopt new technology and practices. And I think like M&A, this will happen maybe 15, 20 years from now. But it does move slow, but I think there is more pressure to do so. You're seeing it now where it's coming in a broader attention. I have little kids and they understand what M&A is. Like they're like, hey, Dad, Elon Musk acquiring Twitter. Like they bring it home and it's interesting. And then now you even listen to earnings calls where it's just interesting investor questions that come up of like, can you explain how you're going to actually integrate that company and extract value from it? So now there's just a lot more awareness about the M&A process and what it entails. So there's a lot more accountability of this execution to success as opposed to execution to close. So I think
Yeah.
that's like the big factor. And then AI, we mentioned, like that's going to be a big changer because it's driving so much more efficiency that now it's creating even a bigger chasm. If you're still trying to run a deal process on spreadsheets and manage the whole thing in the old ancient way, like it's a bigger gap from folks that are now adopting AI technology and just really being much more efficient on a lot of the tactical work that's done manually, and then focusing on the big things at the end of it. There's all the people to people, right? You're blending into companies, the leadership, cultures, and so forth. And those are like the things to solve that aren't done checking boxes. It's done through leadership conversations and being able to like really focus on that. And what are the strategic directions of the decisions that need to be made?
Yeah, well, I mean, and you mentioned a couple of things, culture and people. And whenever you see those studies about, how many M&A deals fail, and I think when they say fail, they usually mean something like not achieving whatever the promised objectives, goals, KPIs were, when the deal was announced. But in all of those studies, the companies that get the people component right, um, and the culture fit right, have a much more successful chance of a much greater ability to actually, make an M&A deal successful. And to me, that's still one of the most overlooked areas. It's so much easier to focus on historical financial numbers, things you can kind of actually, see on a piece of paper, as opposed to how do we, fit these companies together? What's that going to look like? How do we motivate people, excite people about it, in their day-to-day jobs and what they're doing? And I do think that is becoming more of a early focus point for deal makers than we've seen in the past. Are you seeing similar emphasis on those couple of areas?
David, I think we need to set the record straight on what M&A failure is, because I feel like it's so ambiguous. Everybody throws
Yep.
that same fabled number, say whether 70%,
Right.
90%, whatever Big Four
I'm
report.
guilty of that. I throw it out a lot. Right. Exactly.
But it's like, what does it actually mean? It doesn't mean like the deal blew up and all this
Right.
value was destroyed.
Right.
And just seeing this play out, it just, you have an investment thesis. This is why we're buying the company. It's for the technology, it's for the people, it's for the revenue, it's for the geographic expansion. What it usually is just you don't quite, you sort of have a timeline of when you want to get it. It just takes you a lot longer. Like fundamentally, that's what ultimately happens. So hey, you wanted to double revenue in year one. That didn't happen. It took you 2 years to do it, right? It's still
Right.
technically considered in the failure bucket, but it's usually sort of a pretty broad term, but it's still high. You sort of intended to do X, and a lot of times we do make it pretty ambitious of synergies to capture. Uh, that's how the deals get approved, is like there's some clear value to gain, but then actually realizing it is where the miss happens. I think that's like the big thing. When you mentioned the culture piece is, yes, you get people that are motivated, happy, and working well together, they're going to achieve goals. When they're frustrated, pissed off, like they're probably not going to achieve those goals. So that's where that's part of having those people really aligned and motivated, happy, is what's going to produce those results. And if that's a miss, then that's what ends up happening. You're going to end up with some churn, as usually the biggest risk in a deal. When you have churn, that sets you back. And all of a sudden, you got to replace some key people, key leadership. Then that timeline gets pushed back further and further out.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we have this high failure rate.
Yeah, that's right. Well, now I think based on what you said there, Kisan, I want to move us to one of the things I think that you've been writing about a lot. I noticed you put up another post this morning about your buyer-driven, buyer-led M&A process. And what I was thinking about with that is when you hear people, and I forget if it was a NYU business school professor or someone had written a lot about M&A and what its effects are. And I think his thing, which I loved, perhaps a bit of an overstatement, was the single biggest or single most value destructive thing that you can do as an executive is M&A. And I always found that, pretty funny, but it was building on, these statistics that show this, the fact that most M&As don't achieve what, the participants thought they would achieve, and then kind of building on that. But to me, the whole M&A process, at least the way we've, been doing M&A for a long time, almost leads to that result because, as you said, there's such a focus on closing. A lot of executive comp is driven to close, to get, deals announced. Sometimes the biggest bump is really the announcement. The closing is almost an afterthought. The markets assume if the deal's going to close. So it's the announcement of a deal, then the closing of a deal. Very little attention is going backward to see how was that deal. And then you have a banker-driven sell side process that again is heavily geared to a close, whether that's the compensation of the sell side bankers, or even what I do as a lawyer. Our focus is to get a successful closing, make sure things line up so that we can get to a closing. There's really very little incentives or drivers thinking about what makes a deal successful long term, not just to get to a closing. And your buyer-driven, buyer-led M&A process kind of flips the script on that a bit. So tell us a little bit about your thinking around that, and was that driven maybe a bit by the failures that you see from the more typical, I guess, traditional sell side process?
Yeah, I think where it started was just a period of reflection. We did our 300 podcast interview, did a little celebration, and it's like created a little buzz, and it was good, but it got me thinking of like what did I learn from that? There's a lot of conversations, a lot of folks, and it got me thinking a lot, because as you start making a list of all these things, it's like, what does this actually distill down to? And it got me thinking about the maturity of an M&A function. And when you see a company do their first M&A deal, It's how they come with the deal. Maybe somebody pitched them an idea. They just kind of stumbled upon it and it was like, all right, let's try M&A. This makes sense. We got the money to do it. It's typically a pretty seller-led process. They don't just learning it first time doing M&A. Then as you see that function mature, get to like deal 9, deal 10, it's a very different story. Like the whole process has evolved to be very oriented and leading on the buy side from the beginning. Even the way they source deals, being so you and have a clearly defined strategy now. You know exactly what to look for. We're not going to do it the other way. We find the deal, then figure out how to build a business case to go do the deal. It's like we have a very clarified strategy, so we know proactively what to go look for and qualify to go pursue those deals. And then that same approach around being able to understand how this is going to come into the company, really start putting some early considerations around integrating the company, that crystallizing the end state vision, the understanding the company culture is like these key elements that really drive success. The people and leadership coming together, being aligned on what they need to do, being able to have that process information flow so there's clear continuity as we start gathering information and diligence. We can repurpose that information and planning on how we're going to integrate the company and really creating that nice streamline. And then the right time, we're getting alignment from this company. It's like you're doing reverse diligence. Here's the company leadership involved that's coming in. Let's help them understand where they're going, what they're going to do, and get them engaged and motivated versus not communicating that. And all of a sudden, on a seller-led process, it's just purely closed boxes, purely a focus on closing the deal as fast as possible. And then all of a sudden it's open. Everybody's sort of left with announcement day and they have a bunch of uncertainty. They don't know what's happening. They don't know who's, usually there's layoffs associated with it. It's usually both, right? There's some reasons to lay off, but then you're also creating a lot of new roles and opportunities. But it's not communicated. It's all happened so fast. Now we're left to figure it out. Now we're rediligencing the deal all over again to figure out how we're going to integrate the company. So that you see that evolution happen. And that's where started putting it together of like, can we build a framework? That was the original idea when thinking about this. Was there's a clear pattern in how these M&A functions mature. They don't always take the same path, but they tend to get to the same area, what a very buyer-led M&A process looks like. And we've seen that with companies. Usually when they're at 10 deals, some that have done hundreds of deals, and there's a way to define that. And that was the idea of starting to build a very basic framework. Like, let's build some key pillars of what we've identified as a common thread between these organizations and the way they mature that are doing good. They're doing M&A in a way that's compelling, that leads to much better results than having something that's just focused on close, is having a process that's focused on making the deal successful.
Yeah, it's a great, reframing, I think, of what we, traditionally think of as kind of the typical sell side focused M&A process. And I can totally get on board with that. And I know clients of mine that are on the buy side. It's a fantastic way of thinking about it. What I want to try to understand, Keith, a little bit better is how does that work, though? I can totally see that if you're just sort of looking at it very standalone and you're, in let's say a corporate development function, and you're thinking about how do we do deals that are going to move the needle, that are going to create an impact. It makes total sense. How do you integrate that, though, with the reality that a lot of the best assets, a lot of the most valuable assets are, for good or bad, going to come to you through a very strictly controlled, regimented, investment banker driven process, whether it's, a full kind of auction approach, or, I guess nowadays you're seeing more of these kind of soft sell approaches that maybe are not quite a full auction. But how do you integrate this buyer driven framework into what you're inevitably going to run into as a buyer, especially for maybe some of the most competitive assets?
Communication. There is a tendency to default, like, this is the way we've always done it. We've done it for the last 20 years. We run the same process. We have everything on spreadsheets. We use this old school data room that we pay way too much money for. And then, we wait till you close and then you figure out what to do. We'll send you like a floppy disk. I don't know. I don't know if they still send CDs and flash drives that, they mail them and here you go, figure it out. There's a communication in one, starting with the importance of integration, right? Like, we're paying this much money for this deal because we're going to do these things. We're going to do these specific ways, and how it hinges on how well we integrate the company. That's going to allow us to justify paying that amount. Like, that needs to be communicated clearly. That there is a clear correlation of making this deal successful and what it takes. There is a process when you have a competitive process that is controlled by the banker, as well it should be, because they're sorting through and really helping the customer, the seller, identify who's the best suitor and the best fit. And that's a good process to have, is make it competitive and do that. When you get to that point and you have an LOI signed, because you can still start gathering information, but when there's an LOI signed and you're exclusive, I think there's an opportunity to sort of shift things. And this is where it gets interesting, because on the buy side, you have a lot of people involved. I'm thinking of one of our large Fortune 500 corporate development teams that I recently visited. They have about 50 to 75 people involved anytime they do an acquisition. They're doing pretty sizable deals.
Mhm.
That's a lot more people involved than the seller. It's a lot more people involved than the bank. The seller wants to keep it very minimal. They don't want people to know about it. So usually there's just a handful of people that can really provide that level of information. And then you have the banking team, which usually is a pretty lean team to be efficient. And then the buy side, it's very comprehensive, because that company is going to get integrated across the board in all these different departments. So by the time they sign LOI, move into confirmatory diligence, there's quite a few people involved. For that buyer to have a consistent, repeatable, familiar process makes it much, much easier for their teams to be aligned, for their teams to be able to collaborate with each other, work in unison, and be able to create something that's going to be much more efficient, better planned, so they can also not only do the diligence efficiently, they can actually get diligence done faster, which
Mm.
is usually what the bankers can align around, right? Ultimately, they want to get to close fast. And it's like, hey, if we have this consistent process we use as a buyer from the time we sign from LOI to close, we're going to be able to move a lot faster. But the benefit is for them is to be able to have a work stream in parallel, so that they can actually plan how they're going to integrate the company while they're doing their diligence. It's one collaborative environment that buy side team can do the diligence, confirmatory diligence, and the integration planning simultaneously, and really connect those processes together. And that's what drives success. I've seen it where companies, even like a lot of the roll-up companies, are doing a high level of activity. They may typically spend 5 months to integrate a company, because it's pretty straightforward in how they're integrating it. But being able to front load all that planning can compress that timeline down to 2 months. And that's like a huge, different back. So you sort of win on the time to close, make that efficient. But then that's the biggest driver, is creating a well executed plan. And how do you actually combine those companies? And it tends to create a better people experience at the same time. It's just plan better. Not a lot of
Yeah.
questions, not a lot of rediligencing the deal, not a longer timeline, the chaos and confusion. That's where I think where it is. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it with customers. I've seen it on large multi-billion-dollar deals where the buy side's driving it, especially once in an auction process from LOI
Mhm.
onwards, and being able to really own success versus just purely it's a focus to close.
Yeah, this is where, and again, Ivan actually dropped a comment. Always has great comments on these. Um, Start with a why and really begin with that. And I think that's very. I think we're echoing that, um, because I always say, sort of begin with the end in mind. You're talking again about really making sure that you're understanding through all the different phases of the process. Um, what are we trying to achieve? What are our objectives? And then how does that track into the actual M&A process? So Evan, I appreciate that comment. And Evan actually dropped another really awesome comment, that's kind of also in line with what we've been talking about, Kisan. But his question is thinking about, how do you do this? Well, I think we all can see where better communication, earlier integration, thinking about this more buyer focused approach makes a ton of sense, um, and should result in better quality deals, with better value creation instead of sort of the opposite. But his question is, what do you do with the reality that oftentimes the M&A process, even though it may involve some of these larger teams, like you mentioned with the one large public company client that has, pretty big M&A function, it's still a very small subset of, the entire target company, or even on the buy side. So how do you do that when a lot of times people are just not under the tent? They're not aware of the process. We don't necessarily want that everybody to be aware. You're very concerned about confidentiality and other things. So how do you practically, make sure you're able to do that, and communicate in the way that you need to do in order to sort of facilitate that process that you described when
No,
that reality is present?
that is a big one that comes up is how do you manage it where traditionally you sort of keep it really lean as possible, as slim, with a few people under the tent. And that's, I think, the dilemma. That's a traditional dilemma, is that now all of a sudden people are scrambling because the integration people are looped in like way too late in the process. But I think that's this big shift we're already seeing is if it's like a true integration, first of all, and the way the deal team is structured, that it's not separate. There's not two disconnected teams, the deal team and integration team, but it's one unit that they
Mhm.
really operate. And that's like a consistent theme. In fact, even seen now where it's the integration team actually runs all the diligence. We've seen that where they build a combined team that's just all the confirmatory diligence and integrations done through that, where the leads of the integration are running the whole process. So I think that's like, regardless, is knowing who those key folks in that are going to be involved and drive the success of integration, having them involved early. And you've seen it with companies where they have them involved in even pipeline review. They just even know ahead very early, like what's coming up. But I think that's just one of the things. And everybody's on the same NDAs. Like we got to, everybody sort of has a good sense of maintaining confidentiality. But I do definitely see there is a nature in the way the industry is progressing, and taking a buyer-led approach where you have to be proactive and you have to have those right people up front. And it is moving away from keeping it super hush hush secret, limiting it to a few people, and then trying to scramble to do everything towards the end of the process. It's like bringing more of the activity up front.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, one of the really cool AI use cases, is actually some work that's being done by a really super smart, creative professor out of near where I am at Carnegie Mellon, and she's doing some very interesting work about identifying, in deals, who are the real connectors. And it's very interesting that you can use data, and AI to, almost like through emails and other methods, identify in big organizations who are the real, um, connectors, people that, have the ability to sort of communicate across functions, throughout the hierarchy of organizations that you might not think about. But by creating almost a graphical matrix of the connections in a target, let's say, you can maybe better identify who that core team should be. And maybe it's not the people that you ordinarily would think of if you just looked at an org chart. And I found that to be a really interesting way that AI can come in and very quickly, almost like create a graphical web, that you can look at, and you can identify how the organization actually functions, operates, communicates. And I think, and that's a very interesting thing to know in my mind. And it goes along this idea of, creating deal teams on both the sell side and the buy side that, that really can, move the needle on a deal. So I thought that was, interesting. Are you seeing, how does that sound to you? But also, what are you seeing in terms of AI's potential, to change the deal approach and process?
It's overwhelming to say the least. I mean, I feel like every software company has some AI
Yeah, that's true.
capability.
Right.
The thing is, they're all trying to upsell on it
Yeah.
right now, and that's tough, right? I can't go through every app that we have in our company and buy the upsell of the AI functionality. So I see there's definitely a big impact that's going to be because of the capability. And when you start looking at these use cases, and I'm happy to tell a little bit of a journey that we've went through earlier this year, in developing AI capability. But it's in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be the big impact. I think there's still a lot of reservations. Like one is sort of folks are being inundated just left and right with AI, but then there's also parts of the industry. You're obviously familiar in the legal side. Sort of adopting practices and what's policies for organizations to leverage AI, and then the data security components that need to build into it. So there's some time before we really see this kind of move into more of a majority market. I think for us, when we looked at AI, and I liked your example of it, it's like, here's a pretty good example of just starting to understand the right people that should be involved in the deal or their influence. When I got involved to sort of lead a strategy for AI in our company, it started with just some hypothesis of where any ideas can run wild. Like one, I started playing around with building diligence lists and realized like you can really articulate details about target company. It gets a lot more comprehensive about your diligence list. And then when you think of a comparative, which AI is very, very good at, when you feed it information about the parent organization and the target, all of a sudden you get something that's bar none better than any template I've ever seen. And so it's like very interesting capabilities. And then you start thinking about like historical data. Like a lot of companies, they just throw things on spreadsheets, or the data room gets pushed away. But when you start having roll-ups and these companies are doing M&A at scale, and they get collecting all their data in one place, and they have tons of historical data, can you start looking at some of that and providing some insights, like where are the common bottlenecks in the process? Where can we drive more efficiency? What we ended up is coming up with different hypotheses like that, and then in talking to the customers, what it was the most relevant use case was actually legal review, contract review. And it was one, I think, because it was just associated with the clear expense. There's a cost of just actual labor to manually do this. Is there a way that you can automate extracting it? Whether it's a whole series of leases and knowing what are the key terms, what are the start end dates and increases, assignment provisions, and so forth, and being able to pull that out. So that was sort of the first area we really prioritized, was like, what's the most practical use case that ends up being not only the pain point, but one that's like associated with a dollar figure that goes with
Right.
that pain point. And then the next, you start seeing how it evolves for us is like in application and doing automations in application, whether you're looking for information, the ways you can like start clustering information together to make it a lot easier. Like when you're starting to look in things related to employment, can you just pull all those pieces together and really go deep and have that view? And so just kind of expediting the diligence, but then also like the one we're really exploring now is just integration planning. It's that whole thing. Anytime I talk to anybody that works in integration, the number one is I'm not involved in the deal early enough. Well, is there a way to keeping the tent narrow, right? What
Yeah.
can we build off of that? Can we start automating ways to take this early information we get in diligence and just start populating an initial integration plan? Like as soon as we start understanding what CRM system they're using and their tech stack, and we start organizing that and get a sense of how are we going to integrate this company and have that early start at it. So those are sort of kind of near term, like you're already seeing is like some of this pretty actionable stuff that's the practical use case, and especially when there's a driver financially behind it. But then you start getting some of the stuff which, well, you could tell it's going to make a big impact, but it's not as direct of a dollar figure. That's what's coming to the market. And then I think the next third phase is the more of the organizational or enterprise level AI, where it just continuously learns as you're doing more deals. It just continuously learns and gets better with your organization.
Yeah.
The way you can start surfacing insights, what's happening before you ask for it.
Yeah, to me, that's one of the really most interesting and kind of fun things, and it kind of bleeds over to areas that we've already sort of touched on. But I love the idea. You and I have talked about many times this idea that to do effective M&A, it's almost like getting in the gym. You have to get your reps in. You have to build a team that is used to working together inside the company as well as external advisors, as well. And the more deals you do, generally, the more effective the deal team becomes, the more efficient they become, the more adept they are in identifying where there are risks and opportunities. So all of those things are good. People often refer to that as sort of programmatic M&A, not necessarily swinging for the fences, trying to hit a home run every deal, but just doing deals that are incrementally going to add value to the company makes a big difference. And I think AI, one of the really cool things I've been seeing people working on, and I think you're doing that, I believe also through a deal room, is AI is going to allow us not only to think of deals sort of individually, but to build over time so that when you're seeing a similar issue, you're going to be able to almost instantaneously pool the knowledge and the expertise that you might have gained 3 deals ago, where you face something similar. How did we deal with that? How did we think about it? What sort of approaches did we take in the deal process to mitigate that? And did we effectively do that? How did that turn out? All of that stuff now is just lost. I mean, once one deal is done, the VDR is shut down, the closing binders or whatever are filed away to gather dust. It, unless it's in your memory, and you can pull from that, it's almost just wasted. So you almost feel like you're starting from zero on every single deal, and every issue is a new issue, like you haven't confronted before. And I think AI is really going to allow companies to preserve that institutional knowledge base, the benefits of doing these programmatic M&A, and then extract that stuff in real time. And I think I think that could really make a significant difference in how you think about deals and how deals are done.
I think that's well put. I would 100% agree with it, because currently what do folks do? They do, postmortem on a deal, share some of the lessons learned.
Right.
But then you end up with some churn in the team members, or you just have an organization where you don't have the same folks working on the next deal. And then you, even if you're as proactive, where you're building some training and putting some rebriefing, most of the time not. It's all in little spreadsheet grids of what were the lessons learned that nobody
Right.
ever looks at again. But the
Yeah.
fact that you sort of got tools that can just start resurfacing it and becomes part of a knowledge bank that just comes right back, and you build on it. That's absolutely one of the big advantages of when you look at all these different use cases that you can tap in AI.
Yeah. Now, of course, the challenge is then managing all of that. Somebody had messaged me. I forget if it was a post I had made or something. That bankers, lawyers, financial people, they're going to be out of work. As a result of this M&A, as a result of AI and things. And of course, nobody knows exactly where all of that will come out. 5, 10, 15 years from now. But when I look back, even at the time I've been doing this, when I started, there was already like legal research, and computers and things, and people were talking then about the need associates. We're not going to need people to do a lot of that, research. The type of work people do, I think, has changed, but it hasn't changed the number of corporate lawyers or what corporate lawyers do on deals. I think it actually creates in some ways more need for people who can understand the psychology of deals, the people aspects of deals. In many ways, those are the real drivers of getting deals done. And so I think it will free up a lot of capacity to think more creatively about deals, and which deals to do and which ones not to do, and then how to get the ones that should be done, rather than replacing people that are in the deal process. But I don't know. What do you think about that? Like the
Let's have
future
some
of AI?
fun. I'm going to take the devil's advocate
Yeah.
perspective. And although most of these use cases for AI are replacing people, I just had it internally in our company where we've moving some of the budget over between departments, and is specifically to take 2 roles and condense it down to 1, knowing that there's a lot of the activity could be done with
Mhm.
AI. Have you done Waymo in San Francisco? Have you
Mhm.
taken the
Yeah.
self-driving?
Yep.
I did it with my kids when I was doing a road trip this last summer. And first time we did that one ride, and my kids refused to take Uber from then on, or any
Yeah.
other. It's like, no,
Right.
Dad, you don't
I
know
got
if
to
you're
stay on this.
gonna get a bad car or weird, creepy driver. Like, no, we don't know.
Yeah.
You know, Not that they are, most of them are nice, but you never know. And so they
Yeah,
just felt better having no driver and having an
yeah,
autonomous vehicle take them around. And you just think about it. It's like, wow, that's already a lot of jobs there in the same front. Next thing you know, you're at the coffee shop and a robot's going to be serving you. I so I think 3 to 5 years is that timeline. We're really going to see where things are shaking out.
yeah. I guess we'll see whether AI has the capacity to actually, um, simplify. One of the whole reasons I got into posting on LinkedIn was this idea that I wanted to find ways to kind of demystify and simplify, what I thought was sort of an overly complicated M&A world. You're doing a little bit of that in some of actually your Gen Z, posts, I think, which are just awesome. Maybe we could chat about that a little bit. But that's been my goal. What I found is with the new technology, there's just more stuff. There's more information, and it comes at you faster. Um, and that's good. I mean, it's you're getting things quicker, but you're almost, it's almost like an avalanche of stuff, and trying to and having the expertise and the judgment, the skill to figure out among all of that what's really critical, what's really important, what's going to really, drive value, or increase risk in a deal is really complicated. I mean, to me, it's much more complicated now in some ways than it was, before, to do that. And what I've seen with a lot of these AI products that I've looked at is you get a lot more stuff and you do get it faster, but it's that judgment, it's that making decisions around it that, at least right now, I haven't seen. But I agree with you. I'm not gonna, say that that won't come. And obviously, when we're talking 5, 10 years, I mean, right? Who knows? It could be a completely different world. But for now, I think it just makes it more important to have sort of the human factor, the experience and judgment that people have been in the trenches, can bring. And I haven't seen anything, at AI that comes close to replicating that so far.
Data only increases. Every organization is just piling more data. And the one thing that AI is incredibly good at is structuring unstructured data. And that's the biggest value of it. It does that extremely
Mhm.
well, but the reasoning part isn't there. It's just not there to make decisions yet. So yeah, I think that's the view I have. So there's definitely a
Yeah.
lot of use cases to use what it's really good at, but it's the people connections and those decisions still are relevant.
Well, I actually did one of these with a guy who is sort of really deep into AI and thinking about it from sort of the legal perspective, and it was really interesting. I mean, he has a very, I mean, even though that's what he does, he's, first of all, he's got a very negative view on sort of generative AI, for lawyers, at least. I'm talking more for lawyers, because it's kind of the opposite of what lawyers want and what clients want, right? You want predictability, you want repeatability, and generative AI. Actually scares the crap out of people because you don't really know what you're going to get. You don't want iterative changes, things, because then actually it takes more time to try to figure out, okay, what were the changes? Were those good, bad? And so that's an interesting thing. Um, but the other thing that I was thinking about how AI works is, how do you get then people with that experience and that judgment? One of the things I try to tell people when they're doing diligence, which is painful, right? That's like everybody's nightmare. I guess it's the corporate person's equivalent to being a litigator and, getting dumped a ton of boxes of, documents that you have to go through, hoping that you won't miss sort of that one critical one that's buried, in there. But that's, in many ways, though, that's the learning. That's where you really get to see how companies work, how their contracts work, um, how their people work and their processes. And from legal side, you get to learn kind of what are the risks of this particular industry, this company. So that diligence process, if you think about it right, is really a great learning curve process for people that do deals. Um, if you short circuit that in a way, and you cut those, let's say, those people out, and you're having AI or something else doing it, um, how do you then, where do you get the people then that have sort of been in those situations, those trenches, really took that kind of time and energy to learn that? So I wonder about that. It will be a function, I think, of better training and different ways of thinking about that. But there are some downsides, I think, to
I
you know
completely agree.
doing this. Yeah, especially on the bank and the bankers, same side, right? I mean, it's a lot of that, nights sitting there doing spreadsheets, doing valuation models. I've seen just some incredible AI on that front where you're able to model things really fast and you're able to sort of replace a lot of the analyst, work. But that's what teaches you how companies are valued. That's the kind of work that, actually gets you to a point where you can then, make decisions at kind of a human strategic level. So it's interesting. What do you think about how will training and working with people that are newer to the M&A process evolve over time?
I think there's still the work, right? If you work hard, that's like fundamental of what drives success. And leveraging AI, that's part of it. Is like if you give up on understanding the how, and so part of it when I'm leveraging things in my own personal, I'm always trying to dig in. It's like, how'd you come to that? Like how, and at least getting to that where it's not a full
Yeah,
dependency. I'm just relying on this output to go make this decision. But like, give me the explanation of how do we get here? So I think there's a little bit of that where you got to have at least enough personal curiosity to feel comfortable and confident in what you're doing. That's going to take a level of effort. Like you have to work hard for it.
yeah,
So I feel like if you have that, it's going to show at some point that you are that person that really has that comprehensive level of knowledge to understand and confidence versus somebody that just runs with the output and doesn't. And nobody wants to have that because we're not 100% accurate with a lot of these outputs that we get from AI. So I feel like that's the current state it is. Maybe that might change. We're becoming more and more cyborgs. And at some point, we'll have chips in our head, and we're just
yeah.
gonna, be thinking everything and connect that way. So, uh, there's still a little bit of, path where we are that's evolving.
Yeah. Well, having that curiosity, I mean, that's one thing that comes through in the work that you do. And you're always out there talking to really interesting people. It's kind of fun to flip it because now, you came on this one with me, but normally you're on kind of the other side, right? Talking to people. How has that sort of, are you still having fun doing that? How is that? How did that kind of evolve? Because you really do some amazing work on your podcast and meet really interesting people that are doing cool things. And I think that's a great way to learn and also teach other people, but just also stimulate your own thinking about M&A and how you approach deals.
I love it. That's my favorite thing to do. I was so hesitant to doing it. I had a good buddy of mine, Andy, that was a marketing exec that came to me one day back in 2017 of, hey man, you should do a podcast. And I was like, what the hell's a podcast? And his response was like, don't worry about it. It's gonna be the next big thing. You just got to do it. And I was very introverted, non-public facing, very shy, reserved, and challenged myself. Why not? Let's try it. And he tried to simplify it. Like, you already do these research calls for your R&D and software you're building. Just do the same thing. Just publish it. Like, what's the big deal? And
Yeah,
it took some time. I think it was like the third year when I really started getting into it and even started taking some acting classes and things to really get comfortable. And then understanding the big value of it, because a lot of people start a podcast and get so obsessed over followers and this, and it's like that's nothing. That's not even now in this market. It's so hard to do it. There's so many podcasts, but the improvement of communication skills. There's a running joke that folks that worked with me 10 years ago, I used to mumble. They couldn't understand what I was saying. It helped me become more polished in terms of communication skills, which is invaluable. And then on top of it, the ability to network. So many people I've met I would never otherwise had access to, from public company CEOs, folks in the Forbes 400 list. It's just been amazing. And then on top of it, now you can start being strategic in what you want to learn. And whereas we grow our business, it's been helpful for that. But even just shaping up, because my dream is to go back and do M&A, but do it as a principal on a platform I'm a part of. But being able to have this network and folks to really help you, with some complicated deals, so it's been incredibly valuable. I still encourage it. I taught to undergrad, to go grad students. Like, this is one thing to go learn to network on LinkedIn, like get out of your shell and just connect with folks and just try to learn from them. Hey, I want to learn from your experience, but then up level it, go start a podcast. Don't worry
Right.
about following it. Just worry about the value you're going to get improving your communication skills and network.
I mean, I feel totally the same way. We have very similar kind of, background on getting, doing these kind of LinkedIn lives or doing your podcast, and just being consistent with it is something that, it's hard because, as you said, when you start doing it, there's no magic that, instantly happens. But if you're curious about people and what they're doing, it can be a lot of fun. And getting comments like Jemiah said, great webinar, guys. See, that's what I like. You get something where, people are interested in what you're doing, and that, to me at least, makes up for a lot of the challenges when you're thinking, why am I doing this? What possible purpose can there be to sitting here doing a LinkedIn live about M&A? But no, I think it's great, and I've really enjoyed it, and I love what you do with that. There's so many good things. So for anyone who hasn't checked your stuff out at M&A Science and Deal Room, I think it's just terrific. And you were doing those Gen Z things, right? I mean, weren't you?
So a lot of people don't know, I actually did a podcast series with my daughter from the time she
Yeah,
was 9 years old till 11. We called it Boss Move. And we would interview just different influencers, be it actors, Olympic athletes. We
yeah,
had a couple of public company CEOs on there, and it was just a fun like workshop interview.
yeah,
Like, teach me the principles that made you successful. Then, like, you're an audience or kids, like, what's a younger audience? Like, explain it. Give me examples. Can't tell me just be vulnerable and empathetic. What does that actually mean? So it was fun, but just a testament of like, look, she's 14 now, but just the way her skills and comfortability and confidence is,
yeah. I bet.
I'll challenge people. Like, oh, I'm not worried about her. She can hold her own. And we did have some fun with the social. I think that's the thing. You get a little. I used to have her cameo in on some of the podcast interviews, and then I think the last time we took a 3-week road trip around California, and I asked her if she wanted to. She's like, "No, I don't want to do an interview." I'm like, "Well, what do you want to do?" At the time, they were just, her and her brother were teaching me Gen Z terms, and I was like, "Well, why don't we teach people how to use these Gen Z terms in M&A?" And
I
that was
love it.
the idea. And then we started pulling in some folks as I was doing interviews of like, hey, why don't you do a video, and kind of I let her lead the whole thing. Next, she's running the interviews, kind of finding somebody to interview, and it was
Yeah.
a lot of fun.
No, those were great. I only thought, why didn't I think of that? How come I didn't do that? It's a fantastic. I love the idea in terms of the connecting sort of the jargon of Gen Z with what we do in the M&A thing. So yeah, I love seeing her on your little video shorts, and so that's great to integrate her in that. So yeah, she's going to be. I mean, unlike us, maybe that we're a little more introverted or not sure what these this podcast is, or looking in a camera lens. I think she obviously is a pro, going to be a pro already. So that's fantastic. But where can people then find you? I mentioned Deal Room, M&A Science. You do tons of podcasts, these little video shorts, and obviously post on LinkedIn. Any other places that people can go if they want to read more about the buyer-led M&A process, or other things that you're thinking about working on?
Mostly LinkedIn. I want to step it up this next year and post more educational content. I think we kind of post little highlights of events and things that we do, and stuff like that. But I'm looking to develop more shorts in terms of let's sort of really get into the how to, especially as we sort of build our journey to go in that direction, and build pipeline and develop those kind of opportunities. Why not build it in open style? And so mostly just LinkedIn, and then the podcast, obviously, M&A Science.
Yeah, it's terrific. Okay, well, Kisan, thank you so much. I mean, the hour just flew by, as I knew it would. I mean, it's incredible, talking with you about your thinking around M&A, and thanks to everybody that dropped a comment, was watching live. For those who want to pick it up later, it'll still be up, of course, on the feed, so you can watch this at any time. And I know that Kisan or me would love to hear from you if you enjoyed it. If there's questions that we didn't cover that you want us to talk about, happy to do that. So Kisan, thank you so much for joining me from Boston and today. And I hope that you enjoyed it, and it's great talking with you about M&A.
Hey, David, always a pleasure. I look forward to the next collaboration, and
Great.
likewise, welcome the comments, criticism. I
It's
welcome
true.
the criticism, because that's how we learn
Yeah,
and get better.
it's true.
So Should I close
Okay.
out next time?
Perfect. Yeah. Terrific. Okay.
Deal.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you everybody for commenting. Thanks for joining me on these Talking Deals with David shows. And Keeson, thanks again for joining. It was really terrific, interesting. We'll see everybody next time.